Some more folks will jump in. We are looking tonight at learning disabilities. So to me, this is kind of where we're getting to the fun part, where we start looking at the various disability categories and learning how to work with different sorts of students and seeing what we can learn about them. So we will jump right on in. Page 88 and pages 89 give both the definition and then the prevalence of learning disabilities. This is the largest of the special education categories. I think that's true in every state, but certainly true in the state of Texas. And we'll spend some time now looking at the causes. But before we get to causes, I want to talk about the difference in causes and correlation. For example I always use is, did you know that taller kids read better? Well, on the surface, I usually have people immediately say, well, I know this tall kid that didn't read very well, or I know this short kid that read great. That's not really accurate. But when you take it on the whole, your average fifth grader is taller than your average second grader, and your average fifth grader can read better than your average second grader. So when you look at it that way, you can say that yes, taller kids usually read better. Now, certainly you can find exceptions. And this is not a causal relationship. It's a correlational relationship. I can tell you that there's a high correlation between shark bites and snow cone cells. Again, seems totally unrelated. But when you think about it, what time of year are people buying snow cones? In the summer. What time of year are people going into the water? In the summer. Therefore, there's a high correlation between snow cone cells and shark bites. During the months that there aren't many snow cones sold, there also aren't many shark bites because the water's too cold for people to get in generally. So those are correlations. They don't necessarily show any sort of a causal relationship. And we're going to see how some of these may be causal and some of them be more correlational. But we will begin by looking at neurological and then genetic and then environmental. I'd rather call them factors than causes, but the book does talk about causes. So when we look at neurological causes of learning disabilities, this is a problem that is some way related to the nervous system. And when we talk about the nervous system, remember that includes the brain and all the nerves going down from there. So this could be related to a brain injury. It could be related to brain development. It could be related to the structure of the brain. In fact, one of the things that they've been looking at is brain difference research. The technology now is so much better than it ever has been before in being able to scan the brain and see what's happening in the various parts of the brain when different things are happening. So an example of brain difference research is that there's some evidence now that people who have dyslexia have a smaller plana temporale than people without dyslexia. And this is a part of the brain inside of the temporal lobe that for some reason they found a correlation. They say that more people that have dyslexia have a smaller one of these than people without dyslexia. Does that mean it's a cause? No, certainly not. We can't say that at this point. But if this correlation continues to hold, then they may be able eventually to say, yeah, there's something in that part of the brain that may be related to this dyslexia. And when we get to genetic causes of learning disabilities, we're back to that whole genetic thing that we slammed Goddard about last week. Remember, Goddard is the one who said that there was a correlation or a genetic, sorry, not correlation, cause for learning disabilities, mental retardation, all of these sorts of things. And because of that, they began isolating or even forcefully sterilizing people who had disabilities, and would not let them reproduce or would not let them be a part of the community, because he said that there was a correlation and that or a cause rather, and that it was a genetic thing that led to this. So because of that, this whole idea of a genetic connection gets a pretty bad rap, but there are evidences of it. When they did studies of people who had reading problems, and they did a lot of studies with twins, if the twins were identical, they were much more likely to be linked in that they would both have a reading problem. If one of them had a reading problem, then the other had a reading problem, than if they were fraternal twins, which would indicate on the surface that the closer your DNA is to someone who has a reading difficulty, then the more likely you are to have that same reading difficulty. I never get too worked up over one study. And I'll give you an example of a study that gives me a reason to have doubt. There was a study done many, many years ago that took people who drank hot coffee in the mornings and liked their coffee extremely hot, and then they did a longitudinal study, and sure enough, people who drank hot coffee in the morning were more likely to develop throat cancer than people who did not. Well, I kind of like my coffee, so I didn't much like the results of that study. But I don't have to have it super hot. And then I got to looking and thinking about this, and sure enough, years later, another study came out, and it said, because they determined that drinking coffee in the mornings would lead to cancer. Another study came out where they had looked at people who drank hot tea or hot chocolate or other very hot drinks in the morning, and they had the same results as the people who drank hot coffee. So they had to change their hypothesis from the first study, and they no longer said that drinking hot coffee in the mornings is related to cancer. They had to say drinking a hot beverage. So it didn't matter whether it was hot chocolate or hot coffee or hot tea. The problem was this extremely hot liquid going down your throat. So that's an example where they came to the wrong conclusion because they assumed it was the coffee when it was not the coffee. It was just the fact that it was hot liquid. Another study that was done found that the prevalence of dyscalculia is 10 times more frequent in individuals who are related to someone with the condition than would be expected from the general population. So if, say, your father had dyscalculia, and that term means a severe difficulty in math calculation specifically. So if your father had a problem with that, you were 10 times more likely to have dyscalculia than someone whose father did not have that. So there's another case where a genetic cause is being looked at. Certainly nothing is finalized here. They don't have, you read any book, it's going to tell you we don't know all of the causes of learning disabilities. We know some factors and we know some causes, but beyond that, we have a whole lot of correlations and a whole lot of theories, but not a lot of hard evidence. So moving along, we'll look more at the environmental causes. So researchers have provided evidence that environmental factors can cause learning disabilities. Prenatal factors. We're going to look at prenatal, perinatal, and postnatal factors here first. Prenatal factors: maternal drug use, maternal alcohol consumption, maternal smoking during the pregnancy. Now, some of these do result in more severe disabilities like fetal alcohol syndrome, but there is a continuum here that if your mother smoked or drank or used drugs while she was pregnant with you, you are much more likely to have a learning disability, if not something worse. So there we have what can be seen as a causal factor. Excuse me. Perinatal, these are factors that occur either at birth or very shortly after thereafter. Complications such as a twisted umbilical cord can cause anoxia. I had a nephew born the other day, and when he was born, the umbilical was actually wrapped around his neck 3 times. So it could have been a huge problem. When he's actually my great nephew, when my niece went in to have him, her husband told us that when they saw what was going on, that he said it was 20 people. Now, it may not have been that many, but it seemed like it to him. 20 people came into the room where she was delivering and got on top of this situation, and the kid is fine. So, but if you can imagine that if she was in a birthing center, or if she had this child at home, rather than being in a hospital with all of the emergency precautions there in place and all of the trained personnel, then this could have been a very different story. There's also the possibility that a slight brain injury could occur as the child passes through the birth canal. You know, as babies are getting better and better nutrition prenatally, then and parents are learning how to take care of the child before he or she is born, then one of the things that's coming out of that is bigger babies. So you could have a child whose head was larger than what the birth canal could handle, and could end up causing a slight brain injury that may or may not result in a learning disability. We do know that low birth rate has a very high correlation with poor school performance. And you might ask, well, how do we know all of this? Well, remember, part of the referral process that we were looking at are these parental surveys where we ask questions of the parents. Was this a factor at birth? Was low birth rate? Was it, even did they smoke? Did you do drugs? Did you use alcohol when you were pregnant with this child? And so there have been a lot of surveys on this, and so the education field is working on it, but the medical field is also working on it. So that's how they've come up with a lot of this data. Environmental causes of learning disabilities continues with postnatal factors. These are things that occur after the child is born. There are medical factors, such as meningitis. There are also factors such as the ingestion of substances like lead-based paint. There was a time several decades ago when they realized the number one preventable cause of mental retardation was children eating lead-based paint. You may know now that lead-based paint is a banned substance. It's against the law. There are very few places you can find lead-based paint. You can't buy it. You can't find it out there. You don't go to Sherwin-Williams and say, hey, I want lead-based paint. However, there are some things that are still around that lead-based paint was used on. In fact, it was, 2007, when a bunch of toys came over to the United States they've been made in some country, and they were actually painted with lead-based paint. They were toys. I mean, can you imagine this? You buy a toy for your child starts chewing on it, and you find out they're chewing on lead-based paint. And we know that lead-based paint been a huge causal factor in not just learning disabilities, but mental retardation. So we're going to tie this in with the next part here. Although no causal relationship exists, low socioeconomic status and poverty have long been linked to learning problems. All right, let's put 2 and 2 together here. If we haven't had lead-based paint in many, many years, where are you going to find lead-based paint? Well, you're not going to find it in your nicer homes. You're not going to find it in your middle-class neighborhoods. You're going to find it in old apartment buildings, old projects, and things like that, where only the very poor live, or in very old homes that have not been fixed up or done up. And then you would have this paint peeling off the wall. You've got a child who peels the paint, eats the paint, and it leads to a disability, or leads to a problem within the brain that may result in a disability. Beyond that, as we said, there's no causal relationship shown. Low socioeconomic status and poverty have long been linked to learning problems. Part of it also has to do with experiences. What we know about children from poverty is that they don't have books, they don't have educational toys, their families don't take them to the museums, their families don't take them to the libraries. They're too busy just trying to make a living and exist. So there are many, many factors like that that result in more learning problems with poorer students. Poorer by, I mean, socioeconomically poorer. That brings us to Title I. This correlation is so high that the federal government has started years and years ago giving money to schools based on the percentages of students you have who are considered to be low socioeconomic status. And the way schools determine if you're low socioeconomic status is if you qualify for free or reduced lunch. So every year, if you've got children in school, you know, every year they send out a survey wanting to know how much money your family makes. And if you qualify for free and reduced lunch, then they would be glad to give your child free lunch or reduced price lunch, depending on the level of need. And part of the reason they do that is they get paid back from the federal government more than what it actually costs them to take care of your child, lunches and those sorts of things. This Title I money comes in several different classifications. You have school-wide Title I. If there's a high enough percentage of low socioeconomic kids or high enough percentage of kids who qualify for free and reduced lunch in your school, then it becomes a school-wide campus where you can use your Title I funds for everybody. There's also targeted Title I. That means that you have a lower percentage of students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, but it's still a sizable number. And you get these targeted Title I funds, and instead of being able to spend them school-wide, those funds must be spent on helping those kids who do qualify for free and reduced lunch. And then, of course, you have schools that don't qualify for Title I at all. And in those schools, you still may have some poor kids. Had a principal that I worked with, and I was on a principal of a campus-wide Title I school, and she loved to point out that although her campus was the richest campus in the district, right across the street from the country club, she loved to point out that she had the poorest kids in the district, because within her attendance zone was one mobile home park. And she just knew that those were the poorest kids in the district. And she had, I don't know, 10 or 12 kids that came from that mobile home park. So she used to really brag about how great they were doing, despite the fact that they had the poorest kids in the district. Well, they didn't have very many. And it makes a huge difference, as we talked about, just from the factors. I mean, you can imagine the difference in the kids that you're going to have. As a teacher, you're going to be teaching your kids from the very beginning. You'll have books, you'll have educational toys. Some of you already have kids and you're already doing those things. Compare that to somebody who never had the money to go to college. They don't have the ability or the interest to further their education, and all they're trying to do is make a living. Those kiddos are not going to have the same upbringing that your kiddos are going to have, and that highly correlates with eventual success and with learning problems. All right, so when we look at learning disabilities, we say they have a learning disability in this area. And about 90% of our kiddos have a learning disability, who have a learning disability in reading. Now, there are different parts of reading. Phonological awareness. You know, what do those sounds mean? Rapid automatic naming. Can you read those? Can you call those words? Word recognition. Do you recognize, you know, they start off with very simple things. Do you recognize your own name? Do you recognize cat, dog, you know, all these, and then they get into the more difficult words, but they're words you really can't sound out. They're words that you have to just recognize. You know, if you've been through Hooked on Phonics, how do you say the word night? And I'm not talking about darkness. I'm talking about the guy that rides on a horse and, you know, Sir Lancelot. Well, he's a Knigget, right? Anybody that passed Hooked on Phonics knows that he's a Knigget. I mean, you can't sound that word out. I remember I don't know why I have this memory. It's a very strange memory to have, but I remember being in first grade. Mrs. Ward was my teacher at Waverly Park Elementary School, and we were sitting there in class, and she wrote this word up on the board. It said K-N-O-W. She asked, does anybody know that word? And I'm sitting there looking at that word, and I'm like, canal? And Timmy, sitting across the table from me, says, that's no. I said, no is spelled N-O. That's not no. And she said, yes, that is no. And it's the kind of no that you know that what you know. And explain, I don't know why I have that memory, but I do. I remember very vividly learning about the word no. I guess it's because Timmy knew it and I didn't. I don't know. But that would be word recognition. And then you have reading comprehension. There are some kids who seem to be able to read very well. When you listen to them read, seems like they're getting it. Seems like they understand what's going on. But then you start asking comprehension questions and they don't have a clue what they just read. So that's another area of learning disability within the area of reading. Next is math. 25% of our kids who have learning disabilities have a learning disability in math. Now, if you've been paying attention and put two and two together, you said, wait a minute, that was 90%, and now we got 25, we're up to 115% of our kids. Well, the way that happens is that some of the kids who have a learning disability in reading also have a learning disability in math. So that's why it adds up to more than 100. But there are differences within math as well. You could have a learning disability that involves your calculation. It could be a problem with knowing your math facts. It could be understanding of math concepts, or it could be some of that higher order things like problem solving. You know, a lot of times problem solving skills is involved in word problems. So you might have a kid who has a learning disability in reading and he struggles in math with word problems. If you give him the problem, say, you know, 10 times 30 or whatever, no problem. But if you have a word problem, it says the farmer had 10 cows and he sold them for $30 each. How much money did he make? Well, it's still 10 times 30, but the kid can't figure out what in the world needs to be done because of the difficulty with reading. So we talked about learning difficulties or learning disabilities in reading and in math. Written expression is another area where they can qualify. Now, written expression involves a lot of things. Think about it, your handwriting. A real difficulty in handwriting is called dysgraphia. So you've got dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, all these dys's being difficulty in, and then lexia is reading, calculus is math, and graphia is writing. So that all ties in. So difficulties in handwriting. Now this is more severe than just the fact that I have horrible handwriting. If I had you in face-to-face class, what I would do is I would hand you a mirror, and then I would have somebody hold that mirror at such an angle and hold something up where you couldn't see your hand other than looking in the mirror, and I would have you try to write a word. Well, what's happening is what your eye is seeing is what your hand is doing is not lining up. That's an example of a child who has this dysgraphia or a learning disability in the area of written expression, specifically with the handwriting. Maybe it's spelling. Maybe it's in the areas of capitalization. Could be punctuation, vocabulary, organization, and then you get into some of the deeper things, theme development, these sorts of things. So learning disabilities in written expression can have a lot of different characteristics. There are also learning disabilities in language, and these can be either expressive or receptive. So these three kids here are three of my grandkids, and the boy on the left there was adopted. He had been part of the foster system, and he was adopted by my daughter, and he could barely talk when she first got him, even though he was plenty old enough where he should have been able to talk. And it was one of the most fascinating things I've ever watched, because he understood everything that was going on around him. But if you would ask him a question, he had a very difficult time with his expressive language. His receptive skills were fine. But in trying to make a word to say back to you, it didn't happen. He could make a sound. He played charades. He would act things out. He would point. He was doing everything in the world that he could do to communicate with you, but he couldn't just say the words. So my daughter has spent countless hours, and the school folks have spent a lot of time working with him on his expression to where he could say what he was trying to say. A funny incident on the whole thing happened a couple of years ago. I've got an older son. He's an adult son, and he's kind of a Disney buff. And they were talking about different Disney shows and animated features and all that. And he made a comment at the table one night and said, "Oh, I hate Dory. That's the worst animated show ever. I hate Dory." And this little boy looked over at him and he said, "You don't like Dory? Don't watch Dory." And we were just all blown away because his expressive language had come so far. First of all, the kid telling the adult about Disney, but then the fact that he was able to express what he wanted to express and make it very plain and clear showed how far he had come. So teachers who when these things are caught early and work long and hard with them can make a world of difference in all sorts of disabilities. But this expressive one that this child had has been largely taken care of through speech and language pathologists working with him. Success story. So in the whole idea of learning disabilities, we also look at the area of cognition. This can be thinking. Some people just, it's like they don't quite think right. My wife tells me that I think differently than anybody she knows, and she's an educational diagnostician and has tested many, many people. And sometime I'll say something and she's like, "Mark, where did that come from?" Nobody in the world would think that based on that. Where I found that really comes in handy is we work crosswords sometime together, and those, the really weird clues that usually have a question mark behind them, I usually get those because they're out there. They're off the wall weirdo things. I usually get them, and she's like, "Where'd that come from?" I don't know. Another area of cognition is attention. Some kiddos, they just cannot pay attention for long enough. And we expect that with a little baby. You play peekaboo 3 or 4 times maybe. You're not going to sit there and do it for hours and hours and hours. Their attention span is not that long. And you're not going to, close your face and wait for an extended period of time. Real quickly, you're going to do peekaboo because they don't have the attention span to hold on to that for a very long time. Memory and strategy use. I think we all use mnemonic devices a lot, and sometimes we don't even think about them. An example that I use is I cannot tell you over the years how many times people have called me Kent. I don't look like a Kent. I don't think. I'm not sure what a Kent looks like, but I know they're using a mnemonic device, and then they say Clark. Oh, Clark Kent. Superman. Okay, Clark Kent. And then they screw up and don't call me Clark. They call me Kent. It's a mnemonic device that they're using. We all do those sorts of things. You've probably seen a lot of memes that go around, or the Facebook posts where somebody will put some song that we grew up and say, "Here, say this," and then I bet you sang it, did you? Well, that's a strategy that we use to remember things. Is a song. We probably all learned our alphabet by singing the ABC song. Blew us away when we found out that was Twinkle Twinkle Little Star too, right? I mean, just messes us up. And then we get into this whole realm of metacognition. Metacognition is thinking about the thinking. I don't know if you ever have done this, where you sit around and you think, why did I even come up with that? Where did that come from? How did I think about that? Where did I learn something? I mean, one of these days when something comes across and you know it, think back. Okay, when did I learn that? How long have I known that? So that's the whole idea of metacognition, thinking about the thinking. How did I come up with that? When did I come up? Why did I come up with that? What's it related to? Sometime my wife and I'll be talking, and what are you thinking about? Well, I had a flight of thought. And then she goes back and she starts recounting all the steps from where we were in our conversation 5 minutes ago to where she is now. She goes through all the steps that she went to get there. That's an example of metacognition. It's just thinking about the thinking. All right, so the next part of the book talks about identification methods. And we use a lot a pre-referral strategy, such as response to intervention. And we talked about that before, so we'll just briefly hit it again. Response to intervention, or these other pre-referral strategies, are you teach the information. Most of the kids get it. You've got a few kids that don't get it. You reteach in a different way to that group of kids. Most of those kids are going to get it. No matter how many times you look at it or what different strategies you use, you got that one kid or two kids. You got just a very small percentage who, after all of those different interventions, still don't get it. Well, that's when they would begin to look at this child possibly needs a referral to special education. When that referral is made, then there are tests given. These are standardized tests. They are norm reference tests, and you all remember what that means is compared to a norming sample. They are norm reference tests where these children are compared to the norming sample. And what they look for now is a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So if your child goes along and, you know, the IQ is here, and then you go along and you start looking at the testing, and all the testing is down here. You know, it all may be low. Well, that is not a learning disability. With the learning disability, you're going to say, oh, they're high in this area, they're low in this area, they're really low in this area, they're strong in this, they're weak. So it's a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. Maybe they're real good at reading, but they don't do so well at calculation, but they do well at, you know, it can go up and down. So if you see these charted, you do see this pattern of strengths and weaknesses. Now I've got our old friend up here again, the normal curve, because what used to happen, and they don't use this anymore, so don't say this is what they're still doing. They do not use this method anymore. But with the way they used to look at it, the big trigger, and of course there were other factors, but the big trigger was if there was more than one standard deviation between your intelligence and your achievement. So standard deviation on the WISC is 15 points. So you can see that there's the 100 right here. A standard deviation down is 85. So let's say you tested a child and his IQ came out at 101. But his performance on math calculation was at 104. At 84. And you have a 17-point discrepancy there. So you have more than one standard deviation difference between the IQ and the achievement in a particular area. In that case, the child, if the other factors were in place, but it normally would work out that child had a learning disability in this area of math calculation. Now, I tell you that because it still is a pretty good guide. If you've seen testing reports, that's still going to be a pretty good guide. If you see more than a 15-point spread between the IQ and the achievement in any one area, you know that area needs to be targeted and they need to be worked with in that area. So although they no longer qualify based on that, they're going to qualify on that pattern of strengths and weaknesses. It's still a good hint to tell you there's something going on here, and it's definitely something that you're going to need to target to work with that student. All right, we have approach to content. When we start looking at instruction, we have an approach to content, page 101, where we're working on with children on ways to get at the content, maybe in different ways that work alongside of rather than against their learning disability. We have instructional procedures. One of the areas that they have found a lot of success in, and the reason I like this is because we used to use it a lot of times with our students with behavior issues, is this attribution retraining. Say, you got a high school kid, you give them the math test, get back the math test, and they say, oh, I failed this test. You say, why did you fail the test? Well, the test was too hard. So they're attributing their failure to the fact that the test was hard. Okay, let's get down to it. Did you study for this test? Well, no. Okay, so maybe the test wouldn't have been so hard if you had studied for it. So why did you fail the test? Well, I guess I failed the test because I didn't study. So you're changing, you're retraining what they attribute that problem to. Instead of the test being too hard, it's the fact that I didn't study. Why does that make a difference? Well, I can't do anything about how hard the test is if I'm this student, but I can do something about how hard I study. So that's an example of attribution retraining that is great for kids who, I don't know, make excuses, attribute to the wrong thing. It also works in the area of behavior. So we may talk about it again when we get to the area of emotional and behavioral disorders. Then the instructional environment. What are we doing, or what do we need to do to make the environment such that a child can better learn? I've had a lot of teachers over the years who have said, you know, I cannot teach in a room that doesn't have windows. Okay, but have you watched that kid that's got the ADHD? And when you have an attention deficit disorder, this is similar with kids who have a learning disability, but that attention deficit disorder, it's not that they can't pay attention. Their problem is that they pay attention to everything. They can't filter out what not to pay attention to. I have some attention deficit issues going on myself, and it used to drive my wife crazy because we would be at a restaurant or something, and she would be telling me something, and then I would look over and see something happening at a table, and I say, hey, did you see that? Did you see what? And she says, you're not listening to anything I've said. And I can repeat word to word to her, word for word to her, what she just said. It drove her nuts. But the problem was not that I wasn't paying attention to her. The problem was I was paying attention to everything else around me. So I try to make sure that when we go to a restaurant that I'm, you know, not facing the television where I've got that distraction or whatever else. We've actually found that we're better off if we sit on the same side, so we're both seeing the same things, and then we're both paying attention to the same thing. All right, way too much about that. But think about the environment. Think about how you can change the environment of your classroom to help your students learn better, and so that there won't be as many distractions for your kids who are distractible and impulsive as most kids with learning disabilities are. All right, that pretty well wraps up chapter 4. I want to know, how are you doing? Talk to me a little bit, or what do we need to work on? Do you feel pretty good about things? Just talk to me a minute, if you will.
I'm doing pretty good.
Good. Anything you need help with?
Nope, I'm really understanding it. That's all good.
That is good to hear. I haven't taught a fully online course before, and not having student interaction and not being able to see y'all and just say, how's it going, is kind of driving me nuts, but I'm glad to hear that. Anybody else need something from me? Or
When you posted the week 4 reflections, you set them to be due yesterday.
oh, all right, that's a good plan. Thank you for letting me know. I will make a note of that. Did you get them done by yesterday?
No.
No. Okay. Better check all the due dates on module 4.
Yeah, the discussion questions are also, the discussion was also due yesterday as well as the reflection.
Well, the way that thing works is you duplicate module 3 and make it module 4, and then you go in and change all the names. You're supposed to also go in and change all the due dates, which I obviously didn't do. But I did get them, I guess I got the names changed all right. I've also found that one issue that I have in Canvas is that if you go in and make the changes and then don't hit the save button, it doesn't keep them. And I've done that a few times where I've gone in and made changes and come back. It's like, wait, it's just how it was before I made all the changes. So I apologize. I'll get this figured out. Thank you for letting me know about those. Anything else? Are any of y'all on campus, or do y'all all live off campus?
I live on campus.
How's it
I do-
feel? How is campus? Since we're not down there, and my wife's usually down there all the time. So how's it feel?
It's different than I expected because I expected not to come to campus with wearing a mask and like during a pandemic, basically. So it's just different than I expected. But it's actually pretty good though.
Are people wearing masks?
Yes.
See, the people that I've interacted with mostly aren't wearing masks. So that's been interesting as well.
Yeah.
Is that people you live with, or people you work with, or go to class with, or what?
It's mostly people in my dorm.
Okay, so you live in a dorm,
Yes, sir.
and they're just people roaming the halls without mask on and all that kind of thing?
Yes, sir. And we've been told several times to wear masks, but some people don't like to listen to instruction.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I appreciate that, and good to kind of catch up. So I'll go in right now and make changes on those due dates, and y'all let me know if you need anything else. And I do appreciate your time to come and listen to this live. It makes it a lot better for me than just talking to a blank screen. So thank you, and have a great week.
You too.